Okay, we're
How
starting.
many students will there be in here?
We should be 6 plus Lisa.
Okay.
1, 2, 3, 3. Who else is not here? Salim and Shah is Ruby is. Oh, I think it's only Salim. Yeah,
Okay.
we're only waiting for Salim. But we can get started because I know you've got another class as well. So
Yeah.
first of all, I would like to offer a welcome to Dr. Anita, who has graciously given her time for today's session. This was supposed to be at another session, but we've had to postpone it. So thank you so much, Dr. Anita, for making time. I really, really appreciate making you work like this. Is not really something nice, but your area of expertise, the things that you have been working on, is really beneficial for our students, and I thought it would be great if they got that chance with reference to the subject matter, Malaysian literature in English, and the kind of things that we have been discussing this last 8 weeks plus.
Okay.
So for today's session, we're looking primarily at folklore, Malaysian literature in English and folklore. And you have been working in various aspects in this area as well. So I thought it would be great for the students to kind of have a listen at the kind of things that you have been working on. And we will then try to make connections with the issues that we are dealing with, Malaysian literature in English and the folklore of the land, primarily looking at Professor Muhammad Haji Saleh's poem, Sitenggang's Homecoming.
Yeah.
But of course, for today's session, we're keeping it a lot more broader. So without further ado, Dr. Anita, the session is yours.
Thanks so much. Okay. I don't know if you heard the music in the background. I'm actually going to be showing you an excerpt from the Jin Shamsuddin movie later.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, just a bit. But today's class this lecture is actually not going to be focusing on specific mythologies of folklore, but I'm going to be talking about what I've been developing over the past 2 years in relation to my thoughts on revisioning and folklore of the land. Because I've been using adaptation and appropriation a lot. If any of you had attended my guest lecture at IIUM, you would probably have a glimpse of this. And the lecture that I'm giving after this is actually also an adaptation and appropriation because I designed a course to do with that. But for that one, I'm looking at the Lord of the Rings. But for this one, I want to talk about something that has been on my mind since I studied adaptation and appropriation with Professor Julie Saunders back in 2010. The problematics of appropriation, because around the time when I was learning it, there was also a debate going on about cultural appropriation, and I think it's something we need to talk about, especially in relation to folk tales, folklore, and legends that we think is belongs in the public domain. Everybody knows it. It's Malay literature, but it actually comes from endangered communities in our midst. The stories that we think belong to all of us were actually originally indigenous tales of wisdom. So I'm going to put the question out there. It's difficult questions. I'm not going to presume to answer the questions, but putting it out there for you to think for yourself about how we resolve this issue. Having said that, I'm going to share my screen now because I'm hoping to finish this lecture in about an hour. Hang on, give me a second. So you can all see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. So this lecture covers three main aspects. I have no idea what the O is doing there. An overview of the indigenous aspects of the folklore of the land, an overview of the theory of adaptation and appropriation as introduced by Linda Hutchen and Julie Saunders in two of their seminal books, because I thought some of you might not know the terms, and I'm going to spend some time explaining it to you just in case you want to use it later on. And an overview of the ways in which the idea of connection to the land in folklore stems from indigenous communities but becomes assimilated by various waves of settlers, diasporic individuals, and colonizers. So essentially, for me, I interpret the concept of the folklore of the land, which Dr. Raihana gave me. I had to sit down and think about this idea actually. What is the folklore of the land? There's the eco-critical way of looking at it, which I'm not going to really be touching on in this lecture because there's no time. But when it comes to Malaysia, I think we have three waves happening here. The first is the indigenous and tribal folklore of the Malay archipelagos. Yep. This would be the legends and folklores and creation myths of the indigenous tribes in Malaysia, both East and West Malaysia. The evolving folklore of the main settlers of the archipelagos, who became known as the Bumiputra, princes of the soil, along with various indigenous communities who still are known as Bumiputra today, irregardless of what religion they are, because folklore and connections with the earth, nature are not static. Yep. So the folklore of later diasporic communities such as the Indian, Chinese, and Portuguese diasporas is also important. In my research, I've done a lot of work on the Chinese diaspora, how their folklore and beliefs kind of evolve in Malaysia. And you might be interested to know that a lot of the things that people assume to be Chinese folklore also came from indigenous Chinese in China roots. I read with that in another article. Um, but for the purposes of this presentation, I will be looking at the ways in which indigenous folklore was assimilated into the narrative of Malay folk tales and the ways in which popular culture adaptations paved the way towards present-day revisioning. So I interpret the concept of the folklore of the land in various levels of categorization. Why is there a repeat? Sorry, yeah. Okay. Orang asli and orang asal. So there are two separate terms for the East Malaysians and the West Malaysians. I believe orang asli is for West Malaysians, orang asal is for East Malaysians. So there are different groups. Some of them are more prosperous and well situated than others. The Sino-Kadazans, some of my relatives are Sino-Kadazans. The Ibans of East Malaysia being some of the more prosperous groups, while other groups are lesser known and neglected. So in West Malaysia, the more known groups are the Temuan, the Temia. You guys probably know that our school is on Jalan Temuan. That's because we were built on what was Temuan land, yeah. The Temia, the Jakuns, the Sonoy, the Mameri, the Batek, and the Jahai. Now, all of these communities are severely economically disadvantaged. Recently, there was a lot of news about the Kuala Langat reservations that they wanted to kind of like de-gazette, for example. And their lands and resources have been appropriated by various agencies and organizations for profit. However, another less tangible way in which they have been appropriated is through the cultural appropriation of their stories. Now, many of the stories that are now attributed to Malay or national folklore have indigenous origins. These are stories such as Si Tanggang, Sang Kancil, Pak Pandai, and Batu Belah, Batu Bertangkuk, which have been told by indigenous communities for years. Now, when they were assimilated into the main narratives of the land, they also flourished, however, and were retold various times to various media, which is why I have a lot of very mixed feelings about this because I have a lot of fondness for many of those retellings myself. But the fact remains that once we know that these have indigenous origins, what do we then do? This is the question that begs to be answered. Also, the very popular movies made from these folk tales also revive interest in them. I'm particularly in terms of folklore research, I'm not one of those people who kind of like go to the villages and ask questions. I leave that to the ethnologists. In my team, I have at least two people who are ethnographers and ethnologists. But for me, personally, I'm interested in the transmission, the adaptation of the tales, and particularly in Malaysia, I'm really interested in how a lot of us would not know these tales if it wasn't for those black and white movies of the 60s, 50s, and 60s by people like Nordin Ahmad, Jin Samshuddin, P. Ramlee. How these tales kind of like brought the stories to another generation and how the folklore evolving around these tales actually changes when it reaches popular media. So this raises very important questions that this lecture hopes to explore. But first, we need to look at the idea of boundaries. When we look at folklore of the land, when we think about indigenous people, we tend to think of them as being wild and unfettered. And it goes two ways. Some people will place them on pedestals as these wild oracles of wisdom, giving us wisdom from above that we can learn from them. And the other half would kind of like treat them as the abject, othering, talking about them as being uncivilized, while in a very in a way in which they are disgusted by it. If you look at social media today, if you look at the way some of people talk, if they will say like, oh, you haven't bathed or you haven't done your hair, just like an indigenous person, they would kind of like use the term sakai or jakun. And so either way they are still marginalized. They are either placed in a pedestal or they are treated as the abject. But in both ways, their wisdoms are looked on as something that comes from the land and forgets the fact that these are vibrant, evolving communities. They're not there to be plundered or kind of insulted in either way. So this is what Lai Tak Po, who kind of wrote a really excellent book about the orang asli and orang asli says. Now, he says that if the people who are associated mostly with wild, unsafe places, landscape that recall the past, do so, then they remind us of a tradition that we no longer consider ourselves to embody. And just as conservation areas are to be left out of development, then so are the people dwelling in them relegated to the past and their culture to the heap of history. Now, the danger of relegating any peoples to the past or heap of history as though they are not evolving is that people feel free to plunder knowledge from them, plunder their resources because, oh, this is the past, we can take from it. It's communal knowledge, it's public domain, but are they actually benefiting from it? That's the question we need to ask. Boundaries, in short, valorize some ideas and demonize others. Ideas from science and modernity are the engines of progress. Ideas from indigenous people either will die out with time or should be replaced with their scientific counterparts. Not surprising then to hear the common administrative lament that orang asli must change their attitudes in order to catch up. The flow of knowledge should be from the urban and industrial, to the rural and indigenous, not the other way around. So you can see the kind of tension between the two domains here. The modern world has this idea that the orang asli have to catch up, but at the same time not providing them with the apparatus to catch up. Which brings us to the fact that their myth, their folklore has evolved so much to the present day. But what about the stories, the people from which these stories come from? So I'm going to look at the worldview of some of these populations, just very briefly. One is the Batek. The Bateks believe that if there were no people in the forest, the world would collapse. Ergo, as forest dwellers, they are also by definition people who look after the forest. So that connection between earth, the people of the forest, and the people themselves is really important. That's part of their worldview. Note how different is their perception of people. Forest relations from that legitimated in conservation planning. Moreover, contrary to the administrative world view, the Batik's knowledge world is very responsive to the ongoing changes in the environment. I just saw a few days ago across one of my social media, an indigenous scholar said that the original climate scientists were the indigenous people because they are sensitive to the needs of the land. In fact, in many of the folk tales that you see, like for example, Batu Belah and Batu Betangkop or even Si Tanggang, images of the retribution of nature, there's a lot of metaphor implanted in these stories. You may say it's a story of anak dahaka, but the metaphor there is it dahaka towards a mother? Or could it be dahaka towards the land, perhaps? You know? So things that we want to look at. Another fascinating account that I found was this really wonderful article about the BTSISI or Mahmari people. So the BTSISI tell a series of origin myths that they call Trimbo. Two elders traditionally recite the Trimbo cycle on 7 consecutive nights. Trimbo are connected to BTSISI mythical ancestors or Moyang, who require the people to feed them with ritual foods including nasi pulut. Before an elder recites the Trimbo, each night of the cycle, an elder tells a different portion of Trimbo, which includes the creation of the world, the creation of humanity, and the origins of Orang Asli and the flight of Orang Asli from the place of origin. So if you look at each of the Orang Asli communities in our country, they have really, really fascinating creation myths and origin myths. I have a book somewhere in my office about the Jahai origin myth. It's also very, very fantastic, really fascinating stuff. But you can see that they have very evolved mythologies, creation myths, cosmologies, particularly the Kenya people also, yeah. So this leads us to how these entire bodies of knowledge have been demonized or turned into derogatory statements in the mainstream culture. So this is another article by Nathan Pura. Was that his name? Yeah, okay, never mind. In the literature of the oral asli of the Malay Peninsula, the term Sakai has always been problematic. I mean, I knew as a kid, when you say a person is Sakai or Jakun, it means that you are kind of like something wrong with you. You're uncivilized, or you're wild, or you're acting like, the village idiot. It was only when I grew up that I realized there were names of actual orang asli tribes in Malaysia, which makes the term very, very problematic. So the term was a generic and dominant Malay term for a population that lived on the forest margins of the Malay kingdoms. In the earlier literature, the term had disparaging connotations relating to slavery and bondage. So negative was this term that Skid and Blackburn felt impelled to comment in a passing sentence that the term did not mean dog. On the peninsula, the term came to be understood as a term of abuse, and it has been abolished as a name for indigenous peoples since 1960s. The name Orang Asli as a general term for the various forest-based peoples have been used instead. Now, Kuyat, based her argument on other possible etymological meanings given by Skid and Blackburn, has argued that the term Sakai might have originally derived from a Sanskrit word Sakhi, meaning friend, and that would also explain other definitions given, such as retainer and follower of a chief. She argues that the term was not a term for an ethnic group but for people who had entered into an alliance with Malay chiefs, kingdom builders, economic counterparts at an earlier date. It was only during the late 18th and 19th century and under changed political, economic, and religious conditions, particularly due to British colonial involvement, that the term took on a more negative connotation and was pronounced with a tone of disparagement, disgust, or ridicule. I also noticed that I have misspelled Nathan Pura's name there. It's up there. It's Porath. So, if I before I give the slides to you all later, I will kind of like check that. So, I've given you an overview of the indigenous types in Malaysia, how they are connected to the land, how they have complex cosmologies. Now, I'm going to briefly kind of take you to my adaptation and appropriation slides. So, what is adaptation? Now, according to its dictionary meaning, adaptation is to adjust, to alter, to make suitable. So, in short, adaptation can be described as one, an acknowledged transposition of a recognizable other work of works, a creative and interpretive act of appropriation, salvaging, or an extended intertextual engagement with the adapted work. So you can see this extended intertextual engagement with all of the different versions of Si Tenggang, Sang Kancil. I think there's more than one version of Batu Bela, Batu Petangkup out there, Bawang Putih, Bawang Merah. People are still retelling that story, and it's Cinderella. So there are three operational aspects of adaptation. Actually, I came up with the three operational aspects of adaptation based on what Linda Hutchin wrote. I did this to simplify it for my students. So here's the first aspect. An adaptation is an announced and extensive transposition of a particular work or works. This transcoding can involve a shift of medium, a poem to a film, or genre, an epic to a novel, or a change of frame and therefore context. Telling the same story from a different point of view, for instance, can create a manifestly different interpretation. The second aspect is, as a process of creation, the act of adaptation always involves both reinterpretation and then recreation. This has been called both appropriation and salvaging, this depending on your perspective. For every aggressive appropriator outed by a political opponent, there is a patient salvager. The third aspect, as Linda Hutchin puts it, is seen from the perspective of its possessive reception. Adaptation is a form of intertextuality. We experience adaptations as palimpsests to our memory of other works that resonate to repetition with variation. This is why with works such as Adi Fitri Ahmad's Taubat Si Tanggang, you can see palimpsests happening because he's not just telling the tale of Si Tanggang, he has completely changed the tale to take into account superhero variations, other mythologies that have been woven into the work, so it becomes a palimpsest, yeah? Or even, as Julie Saunders says, a bricolage. So here's a nice little flowchart I made for you to understand the three operational aspects of adaptation. First, you have transposition. You transpose from an originating source to create a new work, which brings you to the middle part, which is creation. You create something entirely new from that work, which may or may not be distinguishable from that work itself. Reception, how it is received. How it is received is important because the process of adaptation and appropriation is ongoing. The reception of that work will create other works, which will take us back to the first operational aspects. So it's a cycle that is ever repeating. For example, for writers in the 21st century who have adapted these tales, myself being one of them, perhaps we are on the third operational aspect. We have received these stories to a different source. It was Oleg Mayang. I watched an Oleg Mayang show when I was in high school. Or if it was Si Tenggang, perhaps Adik Afiti Ahmad, I think he did mention in my fairy tale seminar talk that he had watched the Si Tenggang movie also. So he got it from the Piramli movie and he decided to do something new with it. And of course, all of us have been influenced so much by Muhammad Haji Saleh's revisioning of Si Tenggang, where we kind of look at Si Tenggang in a different way and going, hey, maybe he had another reason for what he did, you know? So that creates its own discourse, its own dialogue, and new stories evolve. So the metaphor, the powerful metaphor of the diasporic person returning home and finding home is not the same as how he imagined it. And then the victim, who is the mother, becomes suddenly not such a victim, but she becomes the aggressor instead. And this is a very modern take on the original tale, and the originating tale is lost in history. We only have the modern accounts of it, but this is what we have here. We have these aspects. So Linda Hutchins says there is some apparent validity to the general statement that adaptation as a concept can expand or contract. Writ large, adaptation includes almost any act of alteration performed upon specific cultural works of the past and dovetails with the general process of cultural recreation. But from a pragmatic point of view, such a vast definition would clearly make adaptation rather difficult to theorize. And she says, my more restricted double definition of adaptation as process and product is closer to the common usage of the word and is broad enough to allow me to treat not just films and stage productions, but also musical arrangements and song covers, visual art revisitations of prior works, and comic book versions of history, poems put to music, remakes of films and video games, and interactive art. And this would include perhaps, I don't know, hopefully someday someone will make a Si Tanggang video game and that would be the best thing on earth, honestly. So it permits me, she says, to draw distinctions, for instance, allusions to and brief encounters of other works would not qualify as extended engagements, nor do most examples of musical sampling because they recontextualize only short fragments of music. So Linda Hutchins expands to say that adaptation to her is both product and process, but adds that commonly plagiarism and fan fiction are not considered adaptations. I probably would agree with her on the first. I don't necessarily agree with her on the second. Anyone who writes fan fiction here would probably be
Same, doctor, same.
Ruby. I knew you were going to say something. so, so I disagree with her when it comes to fan fiction because it's a work of art on its own. Yeah. So we have that. So Julie Saunders on adaptation and appropriation. Now, Julie Saunders takes a broader approach to the idea of adaptation, although she builds off Hutchins' general theories. She stresses that adaptation is more than just a straight line from the originating source to product, but involves communities of practice, including fan communities. So Julie Saunders does include fan fiction and fan communities. So Julie Saunders actually kind of revised her book after a few years. So I think she actually took into account all of the backlash that had to do with cultural appropriation and she kind of wrote stuff about that. So she says that returning to my earlier points about Web 2.0 context, our attention has now been drawn to whole new communities of practice engaged in adaptive work, not the least the fan communities who fashion themselves as makers and producers of the new kinds of stories and texts, often in the guise of sequels or continuations. Henry Jenkins has produced impressive ethnographic studies of a number of these communities and subcultures in his research into participatory culture and stresses that we can no longer draw a clear line between producer and consumer. What does this mean to you, purveyor and scholar of Malaysian literature in English? It means that the things that we know of as the folklore of the land or of culture or Malay literature has also been growing in the popular consciousness, and different versions of these tales out there in cartoons, in movies, in the discourse that happens around it on social media. It has become part of a participatory culture. As we continue to rewrite and retell these tales, they become their own product. And studying fan fiction, for example, I mean, if there's, I don't know if you want to consider revisionist fan fiction, but they are actually part of the same ethos. You can see that the community of practice that grows around the retelling, the research of these tales is actually warrants its own research as well. Yep. So in this context, then the notion of an original source begins to be rescaled in the discussion of network distribution and collective interpretation. As texts develop their own incremental history across time and undergo multiple, often multimodal, and sometimes intercultural forms of adaptation and reinterpretation, it also becomes important to consider how a reader or spectator, or indeed producer, to use Axel Brun's suggestive phrase, which consciously blurs the idea of usage and production to create a new model of content creation, encounters the so-called original. The perceived original or source may not, in fact, be the first in the sequence. This is how we have discovered that Si Tenggang, the story as we know it, had a false bottom, as in the source that we thought was the source was not the source. The source was something older, something deeper, which is the indigenous version of it. So, examples of adaptation and appropriation that you can find: allusions. For example, if someone were to write a story that had allusions to the Si Tenggang myth, the question being, when Muhammad Haji Saleh wrote Si Tenggang's Homecoming, was he actually writing about Si Tenggang, or was he using Si Tenggang as an allusion for the story of someone who came back from abroad? Because if you read the poem, you will find it's very modern in terms and very contemporary in its retelling. Yep. Bricolage is when you mix more than one thing together to create an entirely new form. That is Taubat Si Tenggang for you. Intertextuality, pastiche. So you can see those things. Ignore the various examples given on UKM follow. That's on my Lord of the Rings class. Yep. So adaptation and appropriation are inevitably involved in the performance of textual echo and allusion, but this does not usually equate to the fragmentary bricolage of quotation more commonly associated with postmodern intertextuality. In French, bricolage is the term for do-it-yourself, which helps to explain its application in literary context to those texts that assemble a range of quotations, allusions, citations from often a diverse range of existent works of art. So in any of the works of Malaysian literature in English that you are studying, if you find this kind of writings happening, then it's a bricolage. I think the Malaysian author that has this the most is probably Tash Or for me. But you might find it in other works as well. So a parallel form in fine art is the creation of collage by assembling found art items to create a new aesthetic object, or in contemporary music, the creative act of sampling. So, as I mentioned before, cultural appropriation is problematic, and people have been debating this for many years now, ever since in the science fiction community. Elizabeth Bear wrote a very problematic life journal entry in 2009, and there were wars for like 2 years about it online. But from those wars, we started understanding the main ideas of cultural appropriation, and it spread as usual from the science fiction community to other communities, and then it evolved in the mainstream. And here you have an article from The Atlantic. Now, let me just explain. In adaptation theory, appropriation is when you take something from an originating source and you create something new from it. Cultural appropriation, however, is a term that has evolved in popular culture to kind of look at how you have taken something from a culture, you have appropriated something from a culture, you use it, you profit from it, but the culture from which you have taken it from does not get anything. So in the Atlantic.com article that I've linked there, it says that some forms of cultural appropriation are okay. And it says that in the 21st century, cultural appropriation, like globalization, isn't just inevitable, it's potentially positive. We have to stop guarding cultures and subcultures in efforts to preserve them. It's naive, paternalistic, and counterproductive. Besides, it's not just how culture or creativity works. The exchange of ideas, styles, and traditions is one of the tenets and joys of a modern multicultural society. Now, what I am going to suggest is in that case, for example, like in Malaysia, we as a multicultural country, we share certain things, foods, ideas, stories. We can't say, oh, that's Indian food, you can't eat that, you're not Indian. Oh, it's Chinese food, you can't eat that, you're not Chinese. Obviously, it has to be halal. I mean, if you're a Muslim, but you know what I mean. And we share our stories, we share our festivals. Um, I don't think it's necessary to call such things cultural appropriation. I think we should stick to what some people have very clearly defined. Cultural appropriation is the act when a more privileged community appropriates something from an underprivileged community, takes it, uses it without attribution, without any form of credit, without respecting the culture from which they took it. Yep. Examples would be people from the dominant discourse wearing indigenous costumes when they are definitely not indigenous because it's harming those communities. But one thing I do agree with, hang on, mana pergi? Here it is, yeah. This is another article I found which I thought was pretty good. There's a difference between appreciation and appropriation. Appreciation is when someone seeks to understand and learn about another culture in an effort to broaden their perspective and connect with others cross-culturally. So that happens, for example, in the Malaysian context when we appreciate each other's cultures and we want to learn more about it. Appropriation, on the other hand, is simply taking one aspect of a culture that is not your own and using it for your personal interest. Appropriation could mean purchasing a piece of jewelry or clothing that may have important cultural significance to that culture but simply using it as a fashion statement. It could be taking a photo of a ritual ceremony simply for the sake of getting as many likes on Facebook as possible. Regardless, taking a part of another culture without understanding what it truly means can be harmful not only those whose culture you are using, but also to those with whom you share it. So this is a discourse that, I mean, if I want to talk about it, it would probably take too much time in this lecture. I think I have about only 10 to 12 minutes left. But I encourage you to read up more about cultural appropriation, yeah, on your own time if you are interested in it. So I'm going to share with you what Dr. Colin Nicholas said about Si Tenggang. He actually wrote a very long article about it. I've linked it there for you. So that this was an Orang Asli story is beyond doubt. In the textbooks, Tenggang and his parents were described as Sakai, the derogatory term used popularly then to refer to the Orang Asli. Illustrations of the elderly couple also confirm to the stereotypic perception of the Orang Asli, ragged hair, topless, loincloth, wretched looking. In fact, the Malay version that I read when I was in high school, Si Tenggang's mother brings to the ship food. I think it was a monkey's brains or something. Does anyone remember that version?
No, I don't. I think it was kueh in my Malay storybook. It was kueh.
Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't quaint. I mean, I remember one of the versions. I was looking to the Jean Shamsuddin movie to see if it was, but no, in that movie it was steamed pisang salai. But the version I read actually did have monkey. It was a delicacy, and she brought it to the ship for the Si Tenggang to eat, and he was so disgusted. He was so ashamed for his wife to know that this is what he ate at home, which actually kind of links to the idea of wildness and the clash between cultures. So as Colin says, the story as it stands has important implications for the Orang Asli, not the least of which being that the story is but part of the vast body of oral tradition identified with the particular Orang Asli group, the Temuan living around Batu Caves. Such clear references in the legend to the presence of Orang Asli living near the caves since mythical times also add testimonies to their claim of being the original inhabitants of the area. In any case, the legend contributes to the cultural complexity that gives the community its social identity. So, Si Tenggang then becomes a story about not just the anak derhaka, the ungrateful son, but the idea of land rights and the idea of their connection to the land. And what happens when you renounce that connection to the land? Do you become turned to stone? Is that why there's Batu Caves? Yeah. So, however, in recent times, the story of Si Tenggang has been retold without any suggestion of Orang Asli characters. In the 1992 version in the widely read New Straits Times Annual, there is no doubt that Si Tenggang and his parents have always been Malay. There was only Also, no suggestion of any orang asli origin to the story. That's, as I mentioned, quite interesting because the version I read when I was a teenager, there was actually some implication. I wish I could remember who rewrote that. So anyway, here is Si Tanggang. In the 1961 movie, Jin Shamsuddin acts as Si Tanggang, the prodigal son who rejects his mother. He is of humble origins and compared to a monkey by the woman he seeks to woo. He's seen as unwashed and wild. Eventually, he leaves home and reinvents himself and is accorded Datuk Mahkota Negara by the king for his bravery. When he returns, he rejects his mother, who reaches out to him, bringing food to his royal ship. His wife calls women like his mother wild and possibly crazy. So I'm going to attempt to share that part of the video with you, so you can see for yourself the pathos of the scene, but also were they? Oops, sorry. Why are we in Spotify? Sorry, you don't need to see what I'm listening to. Oh no, where's the screen? Sorry. I'm really bad at screen sharing. Okay, I want you to see the pathos of the scene, but more importantly, I also want you to look at how she is described. Yeah, sekejap ya.
Dia juga kenal dengan dia, makcik. Lebih-lebih lagi dengan tuan putri itu memanggil nama Tanggang. Betul ke? Betul ke dia dah balik? Betul lah, makcik. Lebih baik kita sebut dulu. Apa yang dibuat lagi? Kau tak boleh jumpa. Tidaklah, Lemik. Mari kita. Makcik, mana ada anak makcik dalam kapal ini? Makcik tengoklah. Marilah, Nanda. Aku dengar dia ada di kapal ini. Itu pun dia. Itulah dia, Tanggang. Tanggang anak mak, Tanggang. Kau dah balik, nak. Kau dah mencapai cita-cita kau, nak. Mak berdoa siang dan malam supaya kau selamat, Tanggang. Perempuan tua ni dah gila agaknya. Kenapa dia mengaku dia makan dia, Tanda? Tengok rupanya kotor, bertelek, baunya tentu busuk. Jangan kasi dia naik. Oi, jangan naik. Tanggang, kenapa dia tak kasi mak naik, nak? Kenapa, Tanggang? Ya, tengok ya, mak makan kopi tak salah yang kau suka ke sana tu, nak. Ini, Lord Tanggang. Tua keledek, dah tentu lama kau tak berasanya, Tanggang. Jangan kasi dia naik, Kanda. Dia takut apa pula sifatnya nanti. Orang-orang di sini bukannya saja liar, tapi gila, Kanda. Hei, pergi naik. Hei! Kau panggil aku hei saja, Tanggang. Aku ni bangkok. Aku bukan binatang, Tanggang. Kau dah kira nama aku mak aku pula. Mak aku dah tak ada, tau. Mak kau dah tak ada. Jadi aku ni siapa, Tanggang? Tak ingatkan kau. Siapa yang mengawat kaki kau? Masa kau diketik lipan, Siapa yang memperlukan kamar engkau dipukul di lutut? Siapa yang pergi ke rumah orang kaya dinas meminang si Montel hingga aku kena halau, kena maki, kena hamun? Bukankah aku mangkal Tanggang? Kau dah lupa kan Tanggang?
Orang tua yang merepek. Aku Datuk Mangku Negara. Ini sudah Putri Indra Kaca, anak Raja Donan dari negeri Gajah Merah. Lagipun ini bukan kampung aku, kau tahu? Macam mana pula mak aku boleh jadi orang kampung yang kolot tak nolok sering kau ni? Ha? Kalau kau mau kan apa-apa, cakap. Aku boleh kasih. Jika kau tak mau apa-apa, lekas. Pergi berangus balik ke dalam. Pergi!
Tanggang. Bukankah betul mak katakan dulu? Kalau kau dah kaya, kalau kau dah senang, nanti kau lupa daratan. Sekarang kau sudah malu nak mengaku aku mak engkau, Tanggang. Dan kau juga sudah lupa yang kau nak pakaikan aku dengan emas, Tanggang. Nak beri aku rumah besar. Bermacam-macam nanti kau, Tanggang.
Sudah. Aku tak mau dengar ini semua berapa saya kira.
Tanggang, mak tak mau menuntut janji kau dulu, nak. Mak rindu pada kau, Tanggang. Kalau kau nak halau mak boleh pergi, nak. Berilah mak memeluk dan mencium kau dulu, nak. Berilah mak menghilangkan rindu mak dulu pada kau, Tanggang. Tidak takut.
Aku bilang jangan naik. Sudah lekas.
Tapi berilah mak memeluk kau sekejap saja, Tanggang. Sekejap, nak. Tanggang, kesiankanlah mak, nak. Kesiankanlah mak. Berilah mak peluk sekejap saja, nak. Tanggang.
Aku bilang pergi dari sini kalau tidak aku pukul kau.
Pukul anak pukul suka hati kau. Buatkan hati kau.
Perempuan tua tak ada sini. Pergi lama pergi.
Tolong aku, anak. Sampai hati kau berlaku begini, Tanggang. Kesiankanlah mana.
Polakkan perahu itu jauh dari kapal ini. Terang. Bongkar tahu kita belayar sekarang juga. Tinggalkan tempat sial. Mari.
Kesiankanlah mana. Kesiankanlah mana. Dia anakku yang ku kandung 9 bulan 9 hari. Yang ku lahirkan, aku susukan dari kecil sampai besar. Tunjukkanlah balasan atas anak yang tidak membalas jasa, yang tidak mengaku aku ibunya. Oh Tuhan, kau tunjukkanlah pada anak yang tidak mengenal jasa.
Kenapa dia tak sebenarnya kapal kita dah menjadi batu? Gila! Gila! Gila!
Let me just close this. So you can see there how this particular story the version that you've watched has actually changed some aspects of the story we know. What happens to Si Tanggang in the end?
He turned into a bird.
Yeah. So and you can see how they really dramatized it so that everyone is turned to the stone and he has to witness everyone being turned to stone. So they kind of like really brought out the dramatic effects and the idea of the wild woman in the village is actually very Malay, right? But the imputations that they are marginalized even within the society is there from the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie. So you can already see those aspects of marginalization there. And it is definitely a strong culture product, and I think really some really excellent acting in that movie. I mean, from what I can see, Jin Samshuddin managed to convey so many kinds of emotions. So I think it's an excellent movie, and oh my god, why am I showing you guys my Cocteau twins again? I'm so sorry. So it's really important to kind of look at it. So while it isn't very explicitly stated, Tanggang and his mother bear all of the markers of the kind of othering that indigenous people in Malaysia suffer until today. So let's look again at the cultural appropriation of indigenous narratives. Thus, by gradual action of communicating a deception, the collective property of the Temuan in the Batu Caves area became appropriated by another community. In the process, the historical or legendary link of the Temuan to the caves have become diluted in the mind of the public, and over time, the Temuan's own spatial identity with the caves has been affected. So I encourage you to read more about this connection the Temuan has to the tale of Si Tenggang. In a way, the culture community has been subject to a kind of cultural conquest where the weaponry has been bloodless, silent, and dominating. Other Orang Asli stories, legends, and myths have similarly been victims of this sort of expropriation. For example, the many animal stories in which the tiny mouse deer Sang Kancil is featured as a clever animal, are able to outwit the bigger beasts in the forest, are now commonly perceived to be Malay stories. And my PhD student Christopher is actually working on those stories. Even stories about Pak Pandin, the comic fool that is the subject of many Jakun stories. So I have suggested here for you guys some remedies to this. Now, although Colin Nicholas has very strong opinions about the subject, about how these indigenous folktales have been appropriated by the mainstream, the fact remains is that they have become so ingrained a part of national consciousness that they cannot be divorced from the idea of the folklore of the land. And my reasons for talking about that is because of the diasporic consciousness itself. The idea that you cannot take any story that belongs to the land would kind of result in the kind of angst and dislocation that many diasporic and individuals and migrants who want to feel a connection to the land feel. And you can see this in K.S. Maniam's works, which we actually talked about in my own post-colonial Gothic class last week also. I think, Amy, you brought it up, right?
Yes, Doctor.
Yeah, we had a very invigorating discussion about that. And you can see, for example, in Haunting the Tiger, the need to connect to the land. The idea of weird tigers, also in the Malay community, also in the Orang Asal community, they're so part of that national consciousness that it becomes its own lodestone for us to connect to the land, not as a matter of profit, but because of how you want to weave yourself into the narrative of those tales. So, but I've suggested perhaps one way to remedy the unvoicing of the communities from which these tales arise is via the acknowledgement of the sources of these tales, or providing a voice towards the many folk wisdoms that we have inherited from the vibrant indigenous communities of Malaysia, to see what we can learn and return to them. Now, for me as a scholar, it means that, I mean, apart from lectures like this, I usually would prefer indigenous scholars or indigenous writers or members of the community to speak about their tales rather than speak over for them. And the things that you can do is, when you read these stories, acknowledge the source. Where do they come from? When you write about these stories, acknowledge the source. Where do they come from? But at the same time, admit that stories like Sang Kancil, Si Tenggang has become so much a part of our consciousness. Is part of the process of adaptation, as I mentioned earlier, the three operational aspects of adaptation and adaptation. the transposition of it, the creation of it, and the reception of it. The creation of it, you could already see in the Jin Shamsuddin movie how it changed. The reception of it by people like Adi Fitri Ahmad, who wanted to write a story about what happens to Si Tenggang after that. The redemption of Si Tenggang, you can already see in the Jin Shamsuddin movie. At the end of it, he's given time to say, "Forgive me, mother. I recognize that you are my mother." And because of that, he was turned into a bird rather than into stone. Yeah. So here ends my talk. I hope that it wasn't too complex. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Anita. On that note, what you said just now, the last part that you said about Jin Samsudin's version,
Yeah.
that he was not turned into a
Stone.
boulder or stone as previously the way it was read, but as a bird. So, coming from our literary stance, a bird gives that kind of a symbol that, he now can roam around free.
Yeah.
If he was turned into a slug or,
Yeah.
something pitiful like that, then would have a different connotation, right?
Yes, precisely.
Yeah, so that idea. So I really like some of the things that you focused on, and I think that would definitely give our students food for thought. You problematize the difference between cultural appreciation on the one hand and cultural appropriation on the other. So if you could just reiterate the difference, what's the fine line that distinguishes one over the other? Is it as simple as not making profit out beyond using it for appreciation, not getting profit out of it, and if so, how do we distinguish that? Like, for instance, now as a writer yourself, because you're a creative writer yourself, so do you have this kind of hesitance that, okay, I can't use that cultural element because that's not
Absolutely.
where I'm from?
Absolutely. Yes.
Can.
Yeah.
So then how do you balance between, look, I want to tell a good story and I want to use this aspect of the culture, which is not my own culture, I want to use it in my story. So how do you make that kind of a distinction as a writer yourself?
Well, here's the thing. I'm going to circle back to one thing. Is it wasn't me who said appreciation versus appropriation. It was the article, the
No,
Green Heart.
actually, I summarized it in the chat.
Yeah, yeah.
I wanted to make that
Yeah.
clear distinction for
So
the
yes,
students as well.
for me it's like this. The people who complain the most about the discourse of cultural appropriation have been essentially white writers. A few years back, I don't know if you remember this writer. Her name was Lionel Shriver. She at the Brisbane, I think it was the British Writers Festival. She claimed that everyone was being victimized now by people who scream cultural appropriation because she couldn't wear a sombrero anymore. She couldn't do this and this anymore because it would be seen as cultural appropriation. And the thing is, a lot of people were to say, we have no problems with you wanting to eat tacos or eat Chinese food or do all of those things. Relax, sit down. It's like a lot of people were saying this on Twitter also. They're saying, relax, sit down. If you want to do this, do it. But don't position yourself as an expert on a culture that is not your own and profit on it. Like, I think a few months ago, there was this lady calling herself the kanji queen or goddess, and she was doing all sorts of weird thing with the Chinese porridge, like putting blueberries in it, etc. But she was putting herself above the Chinese culture of eating porridge. And then there was another company by another group of white ladies who decided to repackage the mahjong as in I don't know what tiles, and then they reclaimed it. That is what we call cultural appropriation.
So taking ownership over someone else's
Yes.
culture as if it's yours, and then speaking as if you're speaking on
Yes.
behalf of.
Yes, precisely. So if it's problematic when you have more privilege, you have more privilege and you take something that is not yours and you say it's yours, that is cultural appropriation. I had to learn this myself because when I started writing, well, not started because I started writing when I was 7 years old, but when I started actively trying to publish, I was it was at the time when all of this cultural appropriation debate was happening, and I was really upset because I had done so much research on two stories. One had indigenous cultures in them, because my writing mentor at the time was also she's from the Sioux tribe. And I had written a story that had indigenous aspects in it. And in fact, I got her to read it. I got 2 indigenous people to read it, and they told me to go ahead and submit it. And I just didn't want to because I felt not safe doing it.
Right.
And I wrote another story, and I done a lot of research on the Romani people. And I wrote a story about Romani people. And I felt not safe submitting that also. But both of the stories have been published, by the way. For the one with indigenous characters, I actually just put it in my science fiction universe. And rather than have indigenous peoples of this land, I turn it into aliens.
So as a writer, you begin to kind of self-censor yourself because of this fear,
Or
right?
modify. And when it came to the Romani story, I kind of made her half Ceylonese. I mean, I mix myself. So this is how I kind of do it. But I told myself that's the first and last time I'm going to write about the Romani culture because it's not my place. And since then I've actually been very careful about what I write.
Right.
In terms of, because I don't want to get lynched by Twitter mobs.
Okay,
But
we won't hold you back, but I know the students have questions as well. So I'm going to keep mum and let the students take charge. If you all have questions for Dr. Anita, please feel free.
I do. Hi,
Yes,
Dr.
okay.
Anita.
Yes.
I have not been in your class, but I've
Hi,
texted you
Farah.
before.
Yes, you have.
Do you find this rather limiting, or it's actually because you might find it how do I say this? Yeah, but do you find it limiting all this
Not
because
at
you're a
all.
writer? So.
I mean, I used to, but not anymore because I realized one thing. I can write about other cultures. There's no one saying that you can't write about other cultures, but what do you choose to write about? I mean, I would limit myself because, especially so, because I am so multiracial. I have like 8, 9, maybe even 10 types of bloodlines in me, and I could claim, hey, I can write about Middle Eastern people because I have my Middle Eastern blood, and I have. I can write about Indian people because I'm half Indian, half Ceylonese, So I do, but even within those cultures, I mean, I've talked to other diasporic individuals, diasporic Chinese, they feel a discomfort writing back to Chinese culture because they don't really see themselves as people from the mainland would say, you're not pure Chinese, and they feel uncomfortable by that. I think we have different ways of which we kind of like make each other feel uncomfortable about what we can write. But I think for me, the rule of thumb is, will it hurt the community you write about? Can you be respectful about it? I feel so long as you're respectful about it and you're not removing their voice, instead of limiting your creativity, you have to be more creative. As I mentioned before, if I had just written about, I don't know, that protagonist of mine who was in America when I've never been to America before, instead of limiting myself to that, I wrote a story set in space. And I had different cultures in it, and it was very well received. It was a better story than the one that I would have written about a culture that was not my own. It was a much better story. It was published in a professional publication. I don't feel limited. I don't feel censored. I feel I got a better story out of it. So it's how you approach it.
Thank you, Dr. Anita. That's very profound.
I have a
Thank you very
question.
much.
Okay, anyone else?
Ruby has a question, I think.
Yes, Doctor, I miss you so much, Doctor. I wish I can take your class, but I have like 5 compulsory.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah.
But my question is about ethical consumption because
Yes.
I cannot help but to link your presentation with pop culture, because I did pop culture with you.
Yes.
That the stories are all somewhat ours now because we have embedded in our psyche and whatnot. However, remember last year you invited Akia, Cik Mahat,
Yes.
Akia, yes.
Exciting.
Yeah, so I bought some of his books and I started
Oh, I'm so
reading
glad
them.
to hear that. Good.
And
Yeah.
but the thing is, indigenous history when it comes to the Malay people, it's very painful because they,
Yes.
because we enslave them, we
Yes.
pillage them, we hurt them and whatnot.
And
So I
they're still being
feel,
hurt today.
yeah, and they're still being hurt today. So I feel like unless we acknowledge that, I feel like there's no way to ethically
That's
consume.
why I said it's very important to acknowledge the harm that has been done. And once we now know, like I didn't know until a few months ago, I mean, that Sitanggang was an indigenous story. But for me, there's no problem because I'm not writing back to that story.
Yeah, but
I feel
yeah.
any subsequent person who does write back to the story must acknowledge the source, must make room, and must make voice for those indigenous voices, which is why if you had gone for my IIUM talk, you would have realized that they actually wanted me to give a talk on indigenous folklore, and I turned it down. I said, no, I am not indigenous. If you want to have that talk, please call one of the indigenous scholars that I mentioned, because it's not my place to speak for them.
Yeah, that actually answered my question, because I was going to ask what are the steps we can take as
That's one of the
scholars.
steps.
Yeah, because it's very because majority doesn't know. I guess
Yes.
as to those who know, we just have to just keep on
We have to
expanding.
keep on. Like, I mean, whenever I can, I will bring indigenous voices to speak rather than my speaking in their stead. Because that's what I can do as a scholar, as a writer. Simply, rather than write those tales, make avenues for them to. That is important. That's important, an important step. So I mentioned before writing about Romani people, but I will never do it again. Instead, I would rather highlight, if I can, whenever opportunity comes, writings by other Romani people. Which is why you remember for my fairy tale salon, I had 2 Romani people there. That was Paul and Eileen, whom I'm also working with. Why are people muted?
Any other questions?
I have a question, Doctor, because whenever I read about folklore or watch them, for example, like Bawang Merah Bawang Putih, my first encounter with Bawang Merah Bawang Putih is actually in a form of animation, which
Yes.
definitely is not the original form. So I was wondering, how can I find the original folklore so I can like read it and give it like and see how it changes in adaptations. So do you have like any book recommendations that actually speaks about the originality of the folklore?
A story like Bawang Putih, Bawang Merah has variants all over the world. The ATU type, the Anna Thompson Uther type, it has origins all around the world. And my what was it? My master's supervisee just actually submitted her dissertation on Bawang Putih, Bawang Merah, comparing it to the Chinese and Vietnamese folklore types. So stories like that, very clear cut, not indigenous. But we don't know. Who knows? Who knows? We don't know. Is that something that will arise? We don't know the origins of some of these tales. But a tale universalized such as Cinderella, Bawang Putih, Bawang Merah, it definitely has been around. But there is some connection with the land also there, because you have the tree, you have the fish, you have the bones coming out and turning into a tree. There's all very eco-critical aspects of it that you can see there. The same way in which when you look at Si Tenggang, when I look at Si Tenggang these days, it's always from an eco-critical perspective. The person turned into rock, the rocks becoming Batu Caves. This is the way in which the Temuan people claim the Batu Caves as their ancestral land. You know, so again, I say this: we don't know where the originating Cinderella story come from. Perhaps everyone had the same idea because wicked stepmothers apparently are everywhere, or wicked mothers are everywhere. Or perhaps there is an older source. As I mentioned before, I'm digging deep into the Hungry Ghost Festival for the Chinese diaspora. I found that the originating source was actually an indigenous tribe in China. Which makes us question and all of those things that we grew up with, doesn't it?
When you mentioned Batu Bala, I was very shocked, because that was the story that Malay mothers used to blackmail us when I was younger.
But when you think about the story itself, the components of the story itself, you can already see where the indigenous perspective would come in.
Like the rock, and the fact that they had to like even the way they work, even the way they prepare, I think their
Yeah.
food.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions for Dr. Anita?
Go ahead, Salim.
Sorry, who? Salim, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Anita. How are you doing?
Hi, Salim. I'm fine. How are you?
We missed you so much, Doctor, in fact.
That's so sweet of you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Just I have a question, Doctor. Do you think it's enough to write about a culture, about a nation or a culture in generally, just by reading some ideas or some books or listening something about them, without going into much details about them? For example, if you want to write about Kurds, So is it? Do you think it's enough for you just to for example see or listen some videos or some books about them, or just or it's conditional or it's conditioned. You have to mingle with them and mix up with them until to be aware of their weakness point, their strong point, and then write about them, doctor. Thank you so much.
I think to be ethical is best to kind of get viewpoints from them and to ask someone from that culture to read it. That is one of the best ways. That's why now we have sensitivity readers. And happening, like for example, I'm writing a novel right now and I have a family that's Greek in it, and I'm getting my Greek friend to read it because he would have a better idea. And I said, okay, these people aren't purely Greek, they're part Greek but part Malaysian, but I might mess up, so could you please read it for me? And he agreed. So I'm not saying don't write about other cultures, just be aware. Also, Greeks are Europeans and I am Asian, so that the idea of privilege is not there itself. But for example, from the Iraqi situation, are you Kurdish or are you part of the main Iraqi group? Then you have to ask yourself, do you have privilege over them? If you do, then and you want to write about them, I don't think it's an issue because you're Iraqi, but you probably should want to like get someone from a friend who is Kurdish to probably read it. And most of the time, they probably agree. Because I think we are not Americans, we're probably more easygoing about stuff like that. I don't know about how it is in Iraq though. Does that answer your question, Salim?
Yes, doctor. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lisa, do you want to ask first?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
Hello, Dr. Anita. Sorry to take up your time, but
sorry.
I find like what you said interesting about cultural appropriation and feeling. The thing is, what we used to there was a time when we get offended, right, by things people do, be it wearing a headdress of like a hero from certain culture, right? You can't do that and whatnot. But now there's a trend that we can feel offended for others, especially like in the US. That's why they call it white privilege. They now can feel offended for other people of other culture. So for example, a white man does something from another culture and they say you can't do that. That's cultural appropriation. But the Chinese guy was like, no, that's fine. I feel nothing. So, and sometimes it happens like to me too. Like now people are telling me that they're offended. Somebody offended my culture. Now I am offended that you're offended for me. Yes. So sometimes I wonder why these issues, I don't mean like to stereotype, but it's commonly happening with white people in the US particularly.
Because they want to show that they're kind of better than the rest because they're more liberal, but sometimes they can be the worst.
Oh, I see. So it's
I
like
mean,
a privilege,
it is
another version
well.
of privilege to feel offended.
I mean, it depends. It depends on the cultures themselves. Like I think for us as Malaysians, we've never had problems with white people or any people wearing baju kurung or baju Melayu or songkok. But then we must realize that Malay culture is the dominant culture in Malaysia. So that feeling of threat is not there. It's very different from, say, example, someone wearing a Native American headdress, which is very, very sensitive to their culture and their religion, and they have been multiply oppressed and displaced. So you have to see the position of culture and not just say people are reacting. Because if it was a white person going, hey, you shouldn't wear a Native American headdress, I would absolutely agree with them. And maybe if another white person were to tell that, they would listen.
Okay.
You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, yes, I get you.
So that
It
is
makes sense.
similarly the idea, I mean, I think that we should respect the needs of the marginalized people in our communities to be respected and not do things like mimic the way they speak or make fun of them. The Indian community, people like to kind of like waggle their head and talk in a certain way to Indian people as though they will not understand what you're saying if you don't waggle your head or talk in a certain way lah. I can say that because I'm half Indian, but it's actually really disrespectful. You're kind of like implanting a kind of stereotype about them that actually is not the reality of who they are. So it's things like that. It's learning how to be better human beings, essentially.
Okay, Elia, want to ask the final question?
Hi, Dr. Anita.
Hi.
Okay, as for my question, when you talk about how the privileged group writing about the marginalized
Yeah.
community can be categorized as cultural
Yes.
appropriation, but on the flip side, do you agree if, like, in a sense, it gives the marginalized community a platform in a way to, like, represent and expose them because of the um, position that the privileged group has?
Because most of the time when the privileged group appropriate their stories, they don't credit it. If they were to credit it, that's fine. But most of the time they don't. How many people know that Si Tenggang was an indigenous story?
I learned
A
it
lot of
when
you
I
didn't
joined.
know.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't know.
I learned it from
Until
you.
today's class,
Yeah.
until today's class of the fairy tale salon, you probably didn't know it, right? That's what we mean. A lot of white people say, "Oh, we are kind of exposing your culture," but they're not really because they're taking the culture for their own without actually giving profit
Yeah, they're
or exposure
profiting from the product, right?
or taking ideas. And so many of us have had the experience of white scholars taking our ideas without attributing it to us because we are seen as being resources rather than people who are originating ideas themselves. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, doctor.
All
Yeah.
right, brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Anita, for taking extra 15
Thank
minutes
you.
of your time
Thank you,
to
Doctor.
ask
Oh,
it. Oh, Dr. Mel,
right.
sorry, Dr. Mel is here. Dr. Mel, do you have any final thoughts you wanna say
No,
based
no,
on
no,
this?
that was really, thank you so
Yeah.
much. I mean, we couldn't, I'm glad it came, couldn't have come at a better time, or even the earlier the better, but it was so interesting. Um, just one thought that occurred to me as we were talking about cultural appropriation is that, if it's from the non-privileged to the privileged, especially from a colonial sense, we look at it
Mm-hmm.
mimicry, right?
Yes.
So it's the reverse. I'm just
Yes.
wondering, right? It's from mimicry and then to, because when the underprivileged mimics the privileged, it's seen as, well, from the colonial point of view, a good thing. That's what they wanted. But from the other point of view, it's seen as appropriation. So I'm just wondering, yeah, at which point it becomes appreciation and at which point it becomes appropriation. Do you have any personal views on that?
Well, as I mentioned, I am all for the evolving of culture and I like to see intercultural stories. I don't like things where culture is static. That's why when the whole culture appropriation debate started, I was pretty upset because I'm like, I'm mixed. You're saying I can't write anything, is it? you know? But this is how we have discussed it over the years, me with other writer friends, as in if you are privileged writing back to the marginalized and you still want to write about them, nobody is saying don't write. In fact, many people from the different marginalized groups that I've talked to say you can write. But one, credit. Two, find a sensitivity reader or make sure that you are respectful. Don't hurt the community. If you are writing back if you are writing about, say, a more privileged society, make it your own. Many of very, very fine Asian or diasporic writers have written about those societies and made those stories their own because they're not mimicking so much as they are writing back to. They are revolutionizing, they are rebelling against those structures. Look at the works of Salman Rushdie, full of pastiche, full of bricolage, but he has made those stories his own. Look at Kazuo Ishiguro. He's written about old English or Norse settings, but he has made those stories his own. Um, I am all for these kinds of intercultural dialogue so long as we are culturally sensitive about how we position ourselves, how we write it. I am not one of those people who say cultural appropriation, bad, don't write, but please respect. But I draw a very strong line about do not write about indigenous people's stories unless you are indigenous. That's my hard line. My hard line is there. Do not write about travelers or the Romani unless you are respecting them. And that's my hard line. I draw that line in the sand for myself. But other than that, if I want to write about any other culture in the world that has a majority kind of,
His
I will
voice,
go for
yeah.
it. Yeah, I will go for it. But I'll probably try to get someone to kind of like tell me, kind of
And likewise, if you want to study other cultures as well,
Yes.
you may not be from that culture, but you can still
Yeah.
study it with respect, with sense of
Respect.
reverence and
Yeah,
objectivity.
without carrying in that white savior narrative kind of thing.
Right.
It's like I'm talking
Exactly.
about you, right? But then in a way,
Yeah.
it's contextualized you, but actually it's about me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's a very steep learning curve for a lot of us. Like, for
for
those of
sure.
us who are studying other cultures.
For sure.
Yeah.
So on that note, can we please give Dr. Anita a round of applause? Unmute your mics and thank you so
Thank
much,
you, Dr.
Dr. Anita, for that.
Thank you very much for having me. I really hope that people will go look up those indigenous myths, go to the Center of Orang Asli Concerns, read those stories. Because they need to be read, they need to be shared, but obviously don't appropriate them, but share them on your social media.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank
you
you,
for your
Thank
time.
you, Dr.
Doctor.
Anita. I hope to
Bye-bye.
see you next
Very
time.
nice.
Thank you, doctor.
Charlotte, let's register for class next semester.
Let's